President Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin wrapped their historic meeting in Geneva, Switzerland. This is the first time the president has met with the Russian leader since taking office. The pair discussed a number of topics ranging from climate change and human rights to allegations of election meddling and cyber hacking. Unlike past presidential meetings with foreign leaders, Mr. Biden and Putin held separate press conferences afterwards. Putin called the talks constructive, but President Biden took a firmer stance on work that still needs to be done.
The bottom line is I told President Putin that we need to have some basic rules of the road that we can all abide by. I also said there are areas where there's a mutual interest for us to cooperate. For our people, Russian and American people, but also for the benefit of the world and the security of the world.
For more, I want to bring in Ed O'Keefe, Elizabeth Palmer, Christina Ruffini, Olivia Gazis, Dan Patterson, and Heather Conley. Elizabeth is CBS News senior foreign correspondent. Christina is a CBS News correspondent. Olivia is a CBS News intelligence and national security reporter. Dan is our tech reporter. And Heather Conley is the senior vice president for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic. She is also the director for the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for helping us form this fantastic panel. Ed, let me start with you. After listening to both President Biden's post-meeting presser and President Putin's, do they seem to be on the same page in terms of how the meeting went and what was agreed upon?
So far, I think we're going to learn more details, obviously, Tanya, in the coming hours and days about what specifically went on in those conversations and whether there's real disagreement. But you heard them both broadly talk about the concept of sorting out at a lower level details of arms control to ensure that the treaties that are in place will continue well into the 2020s. Talk about cybersecurity. They both seem to acknowledge that cyber hacks, cyber war is going to continue, but they may be starting to outline where exactly is the no-go zone when it comes to that kind of conflict. The president saying he presented the Russian president with a list of critical infrastructure that he believes should be off limits in these kinds of situations, and that if it isn't, then there would be a more intensified American attack. He suggested that there are cyber capabilities the United States has, Russia may or may not be totally aware of. On top of that, he said he outlined what he calls strategic stability. This is what he'd been teasing throughout the week when he was asked, what are you going to talk to the Russian president about? He said, I'll tell you after the meeting. Strategic stability, as he sees it, is an ability for these two countries to coexist and deal with their own national interests, but do it in a way that doesn't lead to unintended conflict around the world and some other kind of either actual war or Cold War. As you heard him say, he doesn't want another Cold War. And then issues like Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine, and the fate of two Americans, Paul Whelan and Trevor Reed, saying off microphone as he walked away that he thinks the two families are going to be in for some good news at some point. That's encouraging to those two families. We spoke with the Reed family yesterday, who says they want to hear more and they wanted to know that things were moving in a positive direction. And it sounds like from what he hinted at here today that that is the case. He is now on his way to the airport and set to fly home to Washington. The Russian president no longer here at this 19th century villa either. So in essence, the show here in Geneva has wrapped up.
All right. And Elizabeth, remind us what is at stake for both countries coming out of today's meeting. What are both the U.S. and Russia looking for? And are these two leaders satisfied with the results from today?
Well, I think President Putin will have to have been satisfied. He got what he wanted, which was a great, big, elaborate summit with the President of the United States, where he appeared as an equal on the world stage. And that will be good for his prestige at home. It's going to take some time to know whether we should take him at his word. He did say that he wanted, if you like, a reset on cyber attacks. He said, listen, Russia's been a victim too, and that a panel of experts, maybe a working group of some description, had to be established to nail down the facts. That could be code for we will take a look at the red lines, maybe put out a few of our own, and work out modus vivendi, where nobody gets hurt and there aren't dangerous escalations. He really signaled that he wanted to continue talks in many ways. And there was a funny moment where he said, look, we didn't stare into one another's eyes and claim to see one another's souls. We didn't pledge eternal love, but it was pragmatic. It was a good working meeting. And he really had some conviction in his voice when in several places he said, we're going to go forward and have more constructive talks. A sign that that diplomatic opening is beginning is the fact that the ambassadors are going to be allowed to return. The U.S. ambassador to the embassy in Moscow and the Russian ambassador to the embassy in Washington. They'd been recalled in April at a particular low point, and they've been literally working from home. So they're going to go back, and that's a good sign, because when the ambassador's in post, then all kinds of back-channel talks can go forward.
And Elizabeth, was there any easy common ground between these two leaders, opportunities for them to sort of easily agree to work together, such as maybe in climate change, for instance?
Well, the one that President Putin identified was work on the Arctic. He said that the Northern Sea Route is going to be of interest and benefit to everybody, and that Russia had no interest in militarizing the Arctic, and it wished to work with the United States. Of course, the border between the U.S. and the Arctic is closest in the Bering Sea. So that could be an easy one to establish some trust and some really important contacts. He did say climate change. He said the epidemic, but the Arctic was the one that he really got fired up about.
Mm-hmm. And Christina, unlike past presidents, President Biden did not hold a joint press conference with President Putin. Why was that? Can you tell us a little bit about why they chose to do separate press conferences and why it's significant?
Well, there's a few reasons for that. One of them was they were worried about ghosts of Helsinki, which is when President Trump did that joint press conference with President Putin and said, you know, he believed President Putin over his own intelligence committee, intelligence officials, as far as whether or not he'd meddled in the election. They didn't want a repeat of that. They also didn't want the Russian press and the U.S. press to be put in a position where the Russian press was propping up President Putin and asking him kind of leading, easy questions that he would be able to hit out of the park. They really wanted to be able to separate it and have President Biden answer questions from his own press corps. And they didn't want it to get out of control. They wanted to control the environment. And the Russians had their press conference, and President Biden had his press conference. Look, these events are always advanced. They plan everything down to every second, every minute, every arrival, or at least they try to. And that very rarely goes to plan. As we saw earlier today, there was a big kerfuffle with the two press corps. There were more Russian press corps than they had anticipated. The U.S. press corps had trouble getting in the room. The summit ended a little earlier than we were expected, and President Biden was asked why that was, and he said they went through the list. They got through their agenda. They made it happen. One of the other things that I thought was interesting when Ed was talking about one of the objectives of this was for the U.S. to lay out those guardrails. This is the things we will not accept cyber attacks on, and you, Russia, whether it's you with the government or someone within your territory, you have to make sure this doesn't happen or there's going to be consequences. One of the things we were looking for is what those consequences would be. And President Biden was asked at the end of the press conferences if he ever threatens a military response, and he said no. He said the U.S. has its own very explicit cyber capabilities, and they will use them if necessary. But one of the questions would be, had this gotten far enough where the U.S. would say, look, if you hit our critical infrastructure, we're going to come back with a kinetic response, which is military. And it seems like they're not there yet. They've warned the Russians. President Biden has spoken his piece and said, don't do this, and we'll have to see whether they do or not.
I want to deep dive a little bit more into what the two leaders discussed in terms of cyber attacks. But Heather, I want to turn to you now and ask you about Russia's occupation near Ukraine's eastern border. What did these two world leaders talk about in terms of Ukraine? How was that handled?
Yeah, we really need to, I think, return to some of those areas where there's the deepest division between the United States and Russia, and that is Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and its continued occupation of nearly 7% of Ukraine. Russia's rapid military mobilization in April and May of this year was in some ways one of the genesis of this actual summit meeting. U.S. leaders were really concerned that they didn't understand whether this was an exercise, a prelude to perhaps a further Russian military incursion into Ukraine. Look, this problem hasn't been solved since 2014. 14,000 Ukrainians died, 1.5 million displaced. This is still a very hot conflict. Again, what President Biden wanted to see was trying to create a little more stability and predictability about Russia's military mobility, its exercises. We have a lot of exercises coming up in this region, both U.S. exercises in the Black Sea region, as well as the Baltic Sea, and Russia has a massive annual military exercise coming up later in the summer and early fall. We need to make sure we have transparency and predictability, and we need to start getting Russia to move back from from Ukrainian territory. I think this is going to be very difficult for the two leaders to solve. Perhaps they can create some greater transparency, but Mr. Putin is not going to give an inch on Ukraine. Belarus now is increasingly in his orbit. As I said, this is going to be an area where the two can talk about their concerns, but I don't see really any immediate resolution. And of course, the Ukrainian people are suffering for that.
And what is, Russia, or at least Russia as it exists under President Putin? What are the long-term designs on Ukraine? Is he hoping to annex it? I mean, otherwise, why would he be concerned about, its effort to join NATO?
There are two critical things. Obviously, President Putin is trying to create a buffer zone between Russia and NATO, and making sure that former Soviet states, such as Ukraine and Belarus, do not try to join the West. Now, in 2014, for Ukraine, that meant joining or signing a trade agreement with the European Union. It didn't mean joining NATO. In fact, Ukraine's constitution at that time prohibited membership in NATO. Of course, Russia's annexation and invasion completely changed that, and now you have Ukrainian President Zelensky wanting to be closer to the EU and to NATO. But again, NATO, there has to be unanimous consent for any new member to join, and that unanimous consent does not exist. But the more that Russia places forces on Ukraine's border, continues to apply enormous pressure, we're going to see more Russian military activity near the border in Belarus this summer. This will have to, increase NATO's force posture, certainly in the Baltic states and in Poland. So this is where we're trying to get some greater transparency to make sure we don't misunderstand Russian military activities the way we were very concerned just in April of this year.
Absolutely. And Dan, I want to turn to you now to talk a little bit more about what was discussed today regarding these cyber attacks that, as you know, are directly affecting Americans. Experts have said that Russia is using Ukraine as a hacking test site before launching similar tactics in the U.S. And, we've already seen these hacks in the U.S. traced back to Russia in recent weeks with the Colonial Pipeline and JBS. There's also the SolarWinds hack. Of course, as you and I have discussed, it's sort of unclear who exactly, they're being sourced to Russia, but it's unclear who exactly is doing it, whether it's criminal gangs, whether it's the Kremlin, whether it's a little bit of both. But I think that is going to make this piece of it so complicated, because let's say that a lot of these cyber attacks, the ones involving ransoms, are being done by criminal gangs. A lot of these criminal gangs support President Putin, and they give him lots of kickbacks, I'm sure. I'm sure he gets some financial benefit out of it. So how can he control that sort of criminal element?
Tanya, at the beginning of this segment, you asked where Biden and Putin perhaps existed in the same realities. When it comes to cyber, they exist in a totally different reality, or at least this is what they expressed during this meeting. Of course, we know Putin and Russia are incredibly sophisticated with cyber, but during this meeting, Putin denied everything. In fact, he claimed the United States was the #1 instigator of cyber attacks, followed by Canada. Also, as you stated, Tanya, this is incredibly important. Although there might be criminal operators in Russia, nothing happens in Russia without Putin's either tacit or sometimes explicit knowledge, including ransomware. And let's be clear, Ukraine was and remains a test bed for cyber attacks targeting critical infrastructure. If we want to learn the lessons of what's happening right now, we should look at what happened in Ukraine in 2016 and 17. In fact, I was there just after the Russian cyber army took down Ukraine, Kiev's power grid. In fact, they were able to log in and actually move the mouse cursors while Ukrainian officials watched. Russia has significant cyber capability, and ransomware has emerged as one modern weapon. Of course, we also know that the modern origins of ransomware extend back to not just the United States and our NSA's capabilities, but Russia's shadow brokers group, which swiped the United States cyber weapons and created a ransomware variant that is now spreading and has spread across the world. We also know that many of these cybercrime gangs are able to operate kind of nimbly or flexibly, and although they can appear as though they are separate from Russia and the Russian government, a lot of the cryptocurrency financing seems to link the two entities.
And so, Dan, how was all of this addressed during today's meeting in terms of what the U.S. response would be? We saw President Biden ask that question, whether that included a military response, and he seemed to indicate it didn't include a military response. So is the threat then one of cyber warfare?
Yeah, so Biden, in fact, spelled this out pretty significantly. Right after he enumerated the 16 components of the United States critical infrastructure, where he said, hey, look, one of the things we need to do is say certain pieces of infrastructure, which you can find on the CISA website, should be off limits. He said that the United States will respond, quote, with significant cyber. And look, he was vague. He didn't spell out precisely what the United States will do, but we do know that under the Trump administration, the United States kind of shifted from a defensive posture to a more offensive posture. So although it's unlikely we will know the particulars, the specifics, I think that it would be hard to imagine a scenario where we don't use offensive and perhaps a blend of offensive and kinetic proportional responses.
Right. Christina, one of the other topics up for discussion today was human rights and political prisoners, including the treatment of opposition leader Alexei Navalny. What more can you tell us about that? And was any headway made on the effort to release Americans being held in Russia through a possible exchange?
Well, I mean, as Ed O'Keefe just said, both leaders essentially said talks are still ongoing. They're in progress. And Ed said, the president said when he got off the podium, a little off mic, I wasn't able to see it here, but he said he might have some positive news for those families soon. When it comes to Alexei Navalny, President Putin was asked about his treatment. And one of the questions that we've heard over and over again is what happens? How does the U.S. respond if Navalny dies in prison? President Putin said, look, he will be treated the same as any other prisoner in Russia. He didn't say that he would allow him to die. He didn't say he would not allow him to die. And it's kind of a macabre question. But the bigger issue here, I think, is how President Putin responded to those general questions about human rights. And that's he threw it back at the United States. He talked about Black Lives Matter. He talked about protest movements here. And that's something we're seeing more and more frequently when the U.S. brings up human rights with countries like Russia. We saw it with China. I was in that meeting between senior officials of the U.S. and the Chinese in Alaska, and it was the same thing there. The U.S. side brought up human rights issues, the treatment of the Uyghurs, and the Chinese said, you have your own human rights issues. Look at your movements. Look at how you treat African American people. So it's interesting. It's a conversation, you know, all politics are local, and it's very hard to get people often to care about foreign policy. As someone who loves foreign policy, it kind of breaks my heart a little bit. But it goes to show you that these domestic problems can be used on a greater international stage, where if the U.S. is not showing a good example, it becomes harder for the U.S. to promote human rights overseas. Now, I'm not saying this is a valid comparison at all. I'm just saying this is a line that we've seen now from the Chinese and from the Russians when we try to address what we see are human rights issues, and they say, you know what, fix your own problems first.
You know, I also thought it was interesting the way President Putin punted a question when he was asked about jailing his political opponents and, you know, his treatment of political opponents. He pivoted to talking about, you know, the Black Lives Matter protests and saying, you know, while we sympathize for the American people, we don't want to have that kind of disorder on our streets. It's sort of a very interesting perspective that he takes it as an issue of order, and he does not want, you know, any political opposition that somehow bleeds into disorder, the way he sees it.
Right. Well, you know, strongman leaders in general don't like people to do things they're not supposed to do. And there have been significant crackdowns, as we've seen, not only on protesters, but as on freedom of the press, on press outlets. One of those press outlets got a question with President Biden today, and I'm sure that was a deliberate move by the White House to say, all right, well, you think these people are you know, government agents? We're going to give them a question here and show you what it's like to have free press. But President Putin, experts we've talked to, and I've talked to some people who are working in Russia, I wouldn't say he's terrified of Alexei Navalny, but he's worried about the precedent that it sets. He's worried that any opposition leader, even if Navalny is not the guy that most Russians want to take over the presidency, he is not Putin. And the fact that there are protests and there is enough support for him among the international community that he can't just do away with him, right? There's so much attention on him, there's so much light on him, that in a way that protects Navalny in prison because the whole world is watching, and Putin knows that. So it's a precarious position for him to be in, because one opposition leader could lead to two, could lead to three. So he wants to keep a lid on that. At the same time, the rest of the world is saying, hey, this is not how this works. You need freedom of speech and you need freedom of political parties. And that doesn't really exist right now in Russia.
And it does get a little messy sometimes when people disagree. Olivia, I want to ask whether we learned any more about Russia's potential link to Havana Syndrome, whether that was discussed at today's meeting.
Right, Tanya, you might think of that item as notably absent from the range of issues that were raised today. And I suppose we can't say for certain where the closed-door conversation went. It's possible that in those limited 3 hours it was also raised, but indications were going into these talks that it wasn't going to be. And I think that's chiefly because the attribution to Russia isn't quite there. Even though there's lots of suspicion circulating among the intelligence community, victims of these incidents, and among senators on the Hill who have been briefed on the intelligence, including Democratic senators who are persuaded that these are attacks originating in Russia. When the Secretary of State was asked bluntly about this during a congressional appearance last week, he essentially said, if and when we establish that a state actor is behind these incidents, that's when we will take it to them. So he was not keen on saying that we know that this is Russia and we intend to raise it. The U.S. government is, of course, still completing an intelligence review of these incidents. And unlike the cyber incursions, the ransomware attacks, we don't have a U.S. agency at this point saying, SVR, we know it was you, pointing at the finger publicly or even privately and saying we have the fingerprints that we need to attribute these incidents to Russia. So that is an area that is going to still have, that the U.S. still needs to do some legwork on, and presumably will be raised in forthcoming engagements to the extent the attribution actually comes through.
All right. Thank you so much, Olivia Gazis. We did have to let Elizabeth and Ed go earlier, but thanks to the rest of you for sticking around and joining us. Christina, Olivia, Dan, and Heather, we appreciate it.